if you can cultivate the skill of listening, then people will tell you what they want.
My name is Merrill Dubrow, CEO of Mark Research. I'm a 35-year veteran of the research and insights community and the host of our podcast, On the Mark. On the Mark is focusing on executives and thought leaders in the world, sharing their insights, strategy, and personal experiences. I promise this podcast will be filled with tough, pointed questions with real, insightful, and emotional answers. Today's guest is my good friend, Jamin Brazil, the co-founder of Decipher, former CEO of Focus Vision, podcast host, business executive, consultant, and frankly, all-around great guy. Welcome, Jamin, to the On the Mark podcast.
Merrill, it is an honor. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's get into it, Jamin. Let's start with this. What have you been up to now? You know, I know I gave you like 10 labels here. Did I even hit one? I mean, what should I have said? How do you view yourself and what are you up to?
So the podcast has been a central theme for my last 2 years, and it's like growing really, really well. The passion that I have for podcasting is taking off too. So I don't know what the future holds for me, but I do know that podcasting and specifically the Happy Market Research podcast will be a big part of that. And then, you know, I got to keep the lights on too. And as you know, Merrill, podcasting does not pay any. It's a great way to spend money. It's not a great way to make money.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Well, at least at the way I'm doing it. You know, this year we've got some 4 great sponsors. That package is sold out, and that's covering our fees for the year, which is, you know, it's 1 full-time employee. And then to supplement our income, we're doing Hub UX, which is basically, if it's a hard to reach audience, then we are really good at recruiting those people on social media, whether it's LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Insta, etc. We've been highly successful at recruiting real people to take projects.
That's great. That's impressive. What I really want to concentrate today is on leadership. I mean, think about it for a second. You know, Focus Vision and founder of Decipher. I mean, those are huge companies, mainstay companies that all the listeners will know and hear about and probably know people who work there. Let's talk about from a leadership, position. I mean, how did you get to that? Were you always a leader? Was that kind of, were you born like that?
There's 2 parts to it, right? One is I have this DNA of leadership that I believe was installed largely by my mother, and then entrepreneurship, which is installed by my father. And those 2 things, coming together for me really put me into I've got to figure out how to chart my own path. Even when I had a full-time job, I was always side hustling. In market research, when I moved into that career in 1996, it was the first time in my entire life I didn't have a side hustle. I was just like 100 hours a week focused on learning this craft. And then I did that for 4 years and then started Decipher with Jamie Plunkett and Erben Andreasen. And then that then brought a lot of self-awareness of me being a bad leader. And so the second part of it, so I think the part of it is like just innate sort of who you are. And then the other part of it is this like ongoing willingness to self-assess and decide what aspects of your leadership style you want to keep and enhance, and then which parts you need to bolster with other people on the team that might help you with the blind spots.
That's interesting. You call it self-assess. I call it self-awareness. What percentage of the people, we're on Family Feud. You ready, Jamin? Let's play a little game.
All right, let's go.
What percentage of the people do you think out of 100 have good self-awareness?
20%.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? I mean, it's just shocking to me. Your number may be accurate, but if you had asked me the question, I probably would have gone a little lower. Why is that?
Well, it's funny. Harvard did a study on this subject, or a student at Harvard, and they asked 11 question survey among 10,000 participants globally. The first 10 questions increased in difficulty. And then the 11th question was a self-assessment. How do you think you did on the study? The outcome of that was people that did badly thought they did really well. So there was there was a negative correlation with their self-assessment and their performance. The point there is that it's really easy for us to sit and judge, and it puts us in a position of power. And I think when we move out of that and then start, before I look at the situation and say, well, gosh, you made this mistake, project manager, how could you have done that? Instead of thinking that, it's like, what could I have done to help ensure that they did a good job? And it might be the case that there's nothing I could have done, right? Or there's nothing within reason I could have done, or maybe there's something in concert. But I have to always start with looking at myself as the leader. This mistake happened, so how could I have repaired that, or stopped that, or prevented that? And I think if you just kind of start there with yourself, regardless of if you're the CEO, or if you're a project manager, or if you're an intern, if you always start with how can I do it better, then I think you just naturally start cultivating that talent. And then I think the second part of it is, you've got to be willing to receive criticism and ask for criticism, because very rarely I've found anyway, very rarely people are willing to give you criticism. Even managers, you think about, like, you probably, Mark, you do employee reviews, annually?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so, in that process, intuitively, you would have this bell curve where you would have these people that are performing really, really well on one side, and then, bad. And then you've got the majority of people in the middle. But really what winds up happening is everybody, if it's a 10-point scale, everybody's kind of like a 5, right? Because managers don't like having the tough conversations with employees, because as soon as you start saying you're doing really bad, then it starts creating some tension there. And so I think as an employee, if you can put that review process on its head, and before you go into that room, like 3 months before, require a one-on-one from your manager and say, how am I doing? The employee reviews are coming up. I want to make sure that I'm a 10 of 10, or whatever the top of the scale is. What can I do to shore up my skills and my delivery to ensure that I am operating at the top 1% of Mark employees?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of takeaways. It's interesting because when I was younger, I didn't have great self-awareness. I didn't know how I came across, and I finally took a step back, and, I had a sharp tongue and was a little bit of a wisecracker. And I remember getting my good buddy, Gary Schumann, in trouble. And I used to have to sit in a cubby hole in 6th grade. And then, I kind of learned that over time. And it's interesting because I'm very close to Ryan Berry from Zappy Store. And Ryan's interesting because, for a lot of reasons, really, really smart, and is somebody who can really have a good understanding of who he is. He asks me and others close to him, 2 or 3, 4 people that are very close to him, to give him a self-awareness 360 every year. And he said, look, don't sugarcoat it. Tell me what I need to do better. Tell me what my blind spots, as you mentioned, are, and move forward. And I really give a lot of credit, because to me, you've heard me say this before, 900 seconds. Get better at something 900 seconds, 15 minutes a day. And if you don't have great self-awareness, you don't know where to start to get better at something.
For me, my big moment of awareness, we did a coach, brought in an executive coach, Kristen, Jamie, and myself, in 2007, or 6 maybe. And it was 2006, right after Kristen joined us. In that coaching session, Jamie, who I had worked with at this point for 10 years, said, it makes me uncomfortable when we're in customer pitches and you use the F word, which is something that I did. Like, it was just like part of my vocabulary. I wasn't trying to be like offensive. It was just part of how I communicated. I was blown away because he had never given me that information before. And then it really caused me to say, okay, well, what other things are happening? How am I'm communicating with other people or being with other people? And so there was this, like, it's not like you wake up and are self-aware, right? It's this ongoing journey. And I found that and this is like such an important key that I wish more salespeople would pick up on. If you can cultivate the skill of listening, then people will tell you what they want. And they'll tell you what they want in the way that they want to hear it from you. And so the hack there is you start the conversation with, tell me what your biggest problem is that you wish somebody would solve. And you can't do that in every meeting, but you can do a variant of that in every meeting. And by becoming the easy button for them, or the connector for that customer, then you immediately start opening up doors for yourself now and later to increase revenue, right? For sales purposes. The same thing applies, though, in a personal development context. And the same thing applies as a husband to your spouse. as well as to your children. So, if you always start with understanding where their pain is, the other person's, then you're immediately put in a position of power to understand if you can address or how you can help alleviate that pain. And then that creates this fantastic opportunity for positive feelings or love to be cultivated.
Yeah, I think there's so many takeaways there, and I couldn't agree with you more. Listen, we know we're right in the middle of this pandemic. COVID-19 is clearly affecting the entire world. What I want to do is just ask you to have an out-of-body experience for a second. I know you have a staff of yourself and another person and probably a few people that from a consulting standpoint that you bring in, but I'm going to give you a staff of 60 people and I'm going to give you revenue, congratulations, of $20 million.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a nice guy. I'm going to give you a mood today. And you're CEO, okay? So the question is, what would you do? What would you be looking at? What would you communicate to your internal team, your external team as a leader, as the guy?
Because I'm the CEO, I'm going to assert that I'm an empathetic CEO to the employees and to the market. And so if that's the case, then I've already built credibility with both of those constituents. I think a successful CEO in times of crisis is a successful CEO leading up to the crisis, before the crisis hit. And it's really important to know that, you've basically decided how people are going to perceive the words that you say before you say them. And I think if in this crisis, if you look at some of the companies that are thriving right now, like Zoom, for example, the reason that Zoom is succeeding over its competitive set is because Zoom was succeeding before the COVID-19 crisis. And so when the crisis hit, there was already an affinity in the market. And then their first thing that they did, straight away, was offer free Zoom to academic institutions, which is this great positive thing, right? That all of us can relate to, because all of us have kids or connections to children, or I say children now that I'm old, but college students, whatever, that are being impacted by this, materially impacted by this. I'll give you an example. I've had 2 ex-wives. I have children with both of them, right? And my current wife. So I've got 5 kids spread out around a 100-mile radius. I get to see my kids normally about 25% of the time during the week, which is basically weekends. Now, because of this crisis, I haven't been able to see my children. They haven't been able to see me. And so my wife coordinated a Zoom call for all of us to do charades for 30 minutes, right? And so the way that I'm trying to answer this question is you've got a tool that is now being institutionalized in the way that we communicate. And the way that it happened wasn't because it was really lucky. I mean, look at Google Hangouts. That existed before Zoom, right? And functionally does the exact same thing. I would argue that it does it almost as well, right? And it's freaking Google. Who can beat Google? The reason that Zoom is dominant is because of its ability to be able to empathetically connect with the user as opposed to drive a quota, which is how all the other products, WebEx, et cetera, have been perceived, in my opinion, how I've perceived them. And so, the message that I would deliver to my employees is that we have one asset, and it isn't the insights that we deliver. It isn't the technology that enables our customers to do stuff. And it isn't the products that we deliver. It's the customer relationship. And so to that end, where my commitment would be is to drive value to my customers during this time of crisis, and obviously subsequently after that. And the way that I would do that would be trying to identify some level of whether it's research on research or, top ways they can do X, or some sort of free thing that creates a value component to my customer base. And then I would come up with a really clear strategy on how we can roll that out in the next 48 hours, right? So it's not ambiguous. It's a clear picture of what success looks like. And then it's just driving that, if it requires company connections every, twice daily for that 48-hour period, then that's what you do. And so, I think about when Google announced I forget what they called their Facebook competitive set, but anyway, right when that happened, Zuckerberg put up a, basically like a "we're at war" sign inside of Facebook's headquarters, and it was like full, at least how I've heard it depicted. It was like a military lockdown. Like, this is a really big problem, and if we're going to survive, we've got to be paying attention. And they obviously weathered that storm remarkably well. And so I think, this crisis actually creates this fantastic opportunity for to create momentum. And so when you think about like the financial crisis, the first part of the financial crisis for Decipher was material, right? We lost 30% of our top line revenue. Coming out of the financial crisis, just 12 months later, we grew by 56%. And that momentum then carried forward for another 2 years. And it isn't because there was material changes to the business that were made. It was just that we were in a position to be able to take advantage by creating focus in the business.
It's interesting. I had a discussion with a friend of mine, Brian Maines, he's in Dallas, and he's in the construction business. He's a builder. And we had a discussion earlier, and he was getting my opinion. I said, "Listen, Brian, I think this is a great opportunity for you." He goes, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "Well, I think that you're going to be able to do things quicker, He goes, "Well, in what way?" And I said, "Well, first of all, you getting around from job site to job site is going to be quicker. You sending one of your team members to go pick up supplies is going to be quicker. If it normally takes an hour and a half, now it's going to take 20 minutes. Not to mention the labor pool. You're going to be able to get labor because everybody just wants to work and doesn't care what they'll be willing to work for a little less. Not to mention, I think banks are going to be a little bit more forgiving with regard to any type of loans, and interest rates are going to go down." So, I built this quickly, and he said, "You know what? I couldn't agree with you more." And I believe this exact same thing. And I think that, look, when we get to the other side of this, okay, and we can sit here and discuss, is that a week? Is that 2 weeks? Is that a month? I don't know. Maybe you do, Jamin. I don't know. But the reality is, I think we're going to be in a better position from this aspect. Every CEO, every leadership team is going through every cost that they have within their enterprise. And there are going to be some frustrated people who are like, "Wow, I can't believe I still had those costs in my company." And I also believe it's going to force everybody to be a little bit more efficient. Instead of doing something in 7 days, how do we do it in 4? And I also think the world is going to have a lot more empathy than it ever had. So I really believe that, once we get to the other side of this, we're all going to be in a much better position. And, and I love this quote. Sir Winston Churchill once said, he said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste," right? Which I think there's a lot of takeaways from that. And I think you're right. I think that leadership to get through this situation started long before this situation, meaning that if you didn't have a certain type of communication style, if you certainly didn't have a certain strategy or leadership style, it's probably going to be hard to get through this if your team, if your clients didn't see that prior. Do you agree with that?
100%. I mean, you trade on, brand is performance over time, and that's what you trade on as an executive. I mean, that's what you trade on, period, no matter if you're executive or not. And so, the broad stroke here for me is like, there needs to be some brass tacks, clear execution against some very easy things. Like, I don't know that this is the right formula, but I'm hosting this week. I've been hosting a half-hour virtual lunch on Zoom. Anybody can join. Every day this week, I've had a CEO from a pharma company.
That's great.
Which is a big deal, right?
Oh, sure.
I know. And then some chief marketing officer from a university. So, and then you can imagine kind of like the normal group of research. And so it's been a really neat opportunity there's no ask there. There's no pitch. It's just, let's come together and talk about this moment in time. And so, and that's just like one example, but you could put together tons of examples or tons of value that could be added to customers. I think about like, this is the time that we can talk at scale, and our customers, our constituents, our employees are listening. So that's this is the time for us to be able to really rise up. And I think, if people aren't accustomed to social or Zoom or whatever, I'll leave you with this note. and the pharma CEO actually said it in the call yesterday. He said, this is the first time in my career where I will do a virtual meeting and 100% of the people will have their videos on. And it's because we're connecting at a new level. So there is a redefinition that's happening of how we're connecting, which I think is important.
Jamin, lots of takeaways. Thanks again for listening to Jamin Brazil. This is the On the Mark podcast. My name is Merrill Dubrow. Have a great and safe day.
Awesome, man. That was great.